we are very pleased to have Justin Drake talk to us today. Um, Obviously, we know that he is a very well known and respected Ethereum researcher. And today it's going to be interesting because he's going to do not one, but two talks. The first one will be on Bitcoin security, and it'll be shorter. And the way that it'll happen is that you can put your questions in the Q&A, and I can like interrupt at any time. We'll have time after the first talk for general questions also. And then we'll go into the main presentation, which is on the Beam proposal, the so-called snarkification of Ethereum. So everybody's very interested in hearing about both topics. And Justin, why don't you take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Campbell, for the introduction. One thing I'll say is that an hour and a quarter is a huge amount of time, and I don't know exactly how to fit it in. So please feel free to ask any questions and interject. And this is meant to be a very casual conversation. And what I try to do is every time I speak, I have like fresh content, and I never reuse slides. And in this case, I've been extremely busy recently, so I've been trying to find creative ways to come up with content. So as Campbell said, I'd first like to speak a little bit about something that's been on my mind, which is the security of Bitcoin. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to be sharing two charts. Chart number one is the one that's open, total transaction fees in Bitcoin, and here is the percentage of the Bitcoin fee reward the percentage of the Bitcoin fees as a percentage of the total rewards, including issuance. So kind of going back to Bitcoin 101, we've all asked the basic question: what happens as issuance decreases and we're left with very minimal issuance? How is Bitcoin meant to be secured? And the answer traditionally has always been we're going to rely on fees. But empirically speaking, fees are just not happening. And actually, fees are so low that I would argue that Bitcoin is not sustainably secure in the medium term. Within a few halvings, I think that Bitcoin security will be low enough that an attacker can try and attack it and even try and draw a profit from it. So the very first chart is basically a macro view of the Bitcoin transaction fees since Genesis. So it starts here in 2009. So there's about 15 years of data. And what I've done here is that I've taken a 30-day moving average, because this is very noisy and you need to smooth things out. And another thing that I've done is that I've set the axis here, the y-axis, to be logarithmic. And what we see is that there's basically been two periods in the life of Bitcoin. There's been this initial period of bootstrapping where there was basically a non-existent fee market. The blocks were not fully used, and anyone who was paying fees was just basically to test out the functionality. And so you can see, for example, on the 9th of October 2010, there was less than 1/10 of a Bitcoin which was spent on fees. And then basically there's been this period of time of about, call it 14 years, where more or less fees have flatlined from a BTC denominated standpoint, and actually they've kind of gone down. So if you look at the very latest data that we have, which is from May 2025, we have about a total fee volume on Bitcoin of 6 Bitcoin per day. And this is a 12-year low. Notice that it's never been this low since a 13-year low since April 2012. And just for a very small period of time, it kind of dipped underneath. And so really, it's kind of a low since 2011. And as I was mentioning before, 2011 is kind of the starting point where we've actually had the beginnings of a real fee market. Anything before that is kind of junk data, if you will. So in some sense, Bitcoin fees have never been this low in the lifetime of the Bitcoin fee market. And one of the things that I expect would happen is that as the price of Bitcoin increases, say 10x, it reaches $1 million per coin, or 100x, it will become harder and harder to sustain this Bitcoin denominated fee. Campbell, I saw you unmuted. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so the fee is flat in BTC.
Yes.
So this graph looks a lot different given the appreciation. But I think your point is there's a limit to that.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to look at it. One of them is that in some sense, the USD denominated fee is not relevant. And the reason is that I think the better ratio to be looking at is what I call total value secured by total value securing. So the value securing, I guess you could say, is the security budget, the total fees. And then the total value secured is just the total amount of Bitcoin in circulation. And both are BTC denominated. And so this ratio doesn't change with the price of Bitcoin. If anything, it worsens as the price of Bitcoin goes up because it's harder and harder to sustain these fees. Now, the way that you would go ahead and attack Bitcoin and draw a profit would be, for example, to short BTC. And the way that you would do that is that you would access some sort of liquid market, like the perps market. And the perps market today is about $30 billion. And what you can do basically is look at this $30 billion as a percentage of the total market cap, which is, let's say, 1.5 trillion. And so very roughly speaking, you can get a short on the order of a couple percentage points of the total market cap. And so the question to ask yourself is the security ratio more or less than this 2% that you can short? And if you do the math, we're talking, and you remove the issuance and you only rely on Bitcoin fees, it's on the order of 1/100%, meaning that the cost of attacking Bitcoin will be 100% of the total market cap. And since today we can draw 2% in shorts, getting 100% is going to be quite easy, especially as when Bitcoin becomes more and more institutional, we should expect liquidity to increase, and so being able to short more than a percentage point should be potentially doable.
So it is a little confusing to me because when we do have halving, the price usually spikes for Bitcoin. So if you look historically around these events, yet you're saying we've got maybe one or two to go before this risk is really a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it's a big deal today, and there's kind of a lack of education. And the reason is that the cost of attacking Bitcoin today is less than the open interest on these perp markets. I mean, Campbell, would you like to venture a guess as to how much it costs in dollars to go attack Bitcoin? And by that specifically, what I mean is acquiring or building sufficient data centers and acquiring all of the mining rigs and ancillary infrastructure like transformers, cooling, in order to permanently perform a 51% attack.
So I've seen that calculus, and it's in a paper that's circulating, but I don't recollect the actual number.
Yeah, so it's on the order of $10 billion. And so, even today, I would argue that Bitcoin is in this fragile state where like a purely rational actor who's kind of willing to see the world burn, but in doing so make a lot of money, could try and perform such an attack. The other thing that I'm concerned about is the fact that
Before you go there, so is the idea that you attack but also have a short position because you spend all this money to attack, and it's going to drive the price, down, obviously, potentially to zero.
yeah, so that's one way to potentially profit, which is to basically compromise the trust and in the whole system, and people lose faith in BTC, the asset, and the price goes down. There are other ways to make profit. So one of them is that you control the fee market. So today, what we have in Bitcoin is a first price auction, whereby if you're willing to pay more than all the others, you will go in because rational entities are trying to maximize their fees. But if you are a 51% attacker, you control liveness of the chain, meaning that you control every single block and every single transaction that goes in. And so that means that you can have some sort of fee policy that mimics a traditional Web2 company. So you could be like Visa and say, I will only let you move your coin if you pay a 3% fee. Or you could be like Apple and say, it's a 30% fee. Or, if you really want to push it to the limits, you could, it might be rational to set a 90% fee, whereby, people will panic and they'll just pay the fee to exit the system and save whatever they can. And so, there are different ways to profit. Another way to profit is with systems like BitVM. So it's kind of commonly said that systems like BitVM allow you to build ZK rollups, but this is a misconception. ZK is used in these Bitcoin L2s, but they are optimistic rollups, meaning that an attacker that controls the chain can censor fraud proofs over a sufficiently long period, for example, 7 days, and completely drain all of the BTC in these Bitcoin L2s. So if, for example, there's $10 billion of BTC in a BitVM bridge, what you can do is that you can steal all of the BTC and at the same time have a short for the exact same amount, so that if the price of Bitcoin goes up or down, you're fully hedged, and that money you've stolen. And so if we ever reach a point where there's more value in a BitVM bridge than the dollar-denominated cost to perform a 51% attack, then it's an extremely low-risk attack.
So Fahad has got a question here. This $10 billion calculation, like, what are the assumptions that are used for this? Because if you think about producing new ASICs to do this, there's going to be a time lag to actually pull that off. And you would also think that if this is supplemented by buying existing miners, that the price would go up. And so there's both a time lag and then this demand effect driving the price up. So it could be much more expensive depending upon the assumptions.
Yeah, that's a great question. So on on the time lag, there's advantages and disadvantages. And in my opinion, these are like roughly net neutral. The disadvantage, as you said, is that if it takes, let's say, X amount of years to perform the attack, well, during that time, the hash rate will go up and you need to acquire more hardware. But on the other hand, all of the hardware that you've partially set up, so for example, let's say you've set up the equivalent of 10% of the hash rate, that is hardware that is bringing in revenue and is paying for itself while you're setting up the rest of the hash rate. So let's say that you bought a mining rig for $10,000 and you expect that in 2 years' time you're gonna perform the attack. If you set up the mining rig today and you let it run for 2 years, well, that might bring in, let's say, $5,000 of income. And so by the time you've made the attack, actually the real cost of the rig was not $10,000, but only half of that, $5,000. And so basically, as you gradually ramp up, you're recouping your costs by just mining like a rational miner would, a non-attacking miner. Now, in terms of acquiring the hardware, yes, there are limits to the fab capacity, but we're talking about absolutely minuscule amounts of silicon in the grand scheme of things, like significantly less than 1% of the annual production. I mean, here's a question for you, Campbell. How many mining rigs are currently securing the Bitcoin network? Like, how many machines are roughly like securing the network?
I don't know, but I could probably guess. I don't know, like 75,000.
Oh, it's way more.
Okay.
I mean, like a large college campus, might have like 74,000 machines, and that we're talking about millions of machines. Let's say 2 to 3 million machines. But everyone at home has a machine, and there's billions of us. So ultimately, the total amount of silicon relative to what can be produced is very, very low. Like we produce hundreds of millions of devices every year, and here we're talking about a couple million devices. I mean, one critique that people bring forward is, what about the power consumption? So Bitcoin draws about 20 gigawatts of power, which is roughly the equivalent of 10 million space heaters. So again, 10 million space heaters, that sounds like a lot, but everyone at home has a radiator or a space heater or a toaster. 10 million toasters are securing Bitcoin right now. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot, especially for a nation state. I mean, one data point that I like bringing up is that Texas can produce 80 gigawatts. So a single state can produce 4x what is currently securing Bitcoin. But I'd like to move on to the second chart, because this one is potentially like even more interesting, which is that we are all familiar with the halving, and implicitly what we understand by that is the issuance halving. But what is also happening is that the fees are also halving. So every 4 years, the fees halve. So the way to see this is, so this is a 90-day moving average of the percentage. So here we're at about 1.3%. And again, this is the whole historical data. This is 15 years worth of data. And what you can see is that this percentage is not going up. There's a wave here, and then it goes back to 1%, a wave here, back to 1%, a wave here, back to 1%. And so the contribution from fees hasn't grown since 2016. So basically, we're at a 9-year low. And actually, if you look at the area under the curve here, it keeps on shrinking. So this little bump here has a smaller area than this bump here, and here this bump here has even less area. So it's actually the fees from a BTC denominated standpoint are decreasing faster than issuance, even faster than once every 4 years. And this kind of makes sense because the price of BTC is increasing, and as it increases, it becomes harder and harder to sustain these high BTC denominated fees. And actually, if you're willing to go all of the way back to 2013, we also reached a point where it was about 1%. So in some sense, the fee contribution hasn't changed since 2013, which is a 12-year low. So yeah, this is what I wanted to share. If we imagine that issuance disappears completely, like 99% of the revenue for miners goes away, we're left with the 1% of fees. What should we expect? We should expect that the total power equivalent to drop by a factor of 100. So we go from 20 gigawatts securing Bitcoin to about 200 megawatts. And just to put this in context, we have one miner called Riot Mining. They have this 1 gigawatt site, right? So this one site is capable of would be capable of 51% attacking Bitcoin 5 times over if we were in a position where suddenly issuance goes to 0 and we're left with only the equivalent of 1% securing Bitcoin. Now, one of the things that we're starting to see is, some politicians like Senator Cynthia Lummis, I believe, who are making recommendations for entities like the United States government to acquire Bitcoin and to hold it for 20 years. Now, 20 years is the equivalent of 5 halvings, which is a 32x reduction in issuance. My prediction is that Bitcoin, as it exists today, won't be around in 20 years. And so it's, in some sense, it's a bit of a crazy proposal, which I don't think is rooted in malice. It's just kind of rooted in potential ignorance.
So we've got a couple of questions. So Fahad, commenting on this graph, the fees are actually increasing if we do this in dollar value, and the cost of an attack are actually dollar denominated also. And then the second question is that this information is public information. So the Bitcoin price is going up. So is it that the market is not properly assessing the risks in the long term? Because the price reflects like value in the future to today. So those two things. So fees going up, and if this is a risk for the longer term, why is the price today almost 100,000?
Right. So to address the first question around the fact that fees are USD denominated, and so that's what we should be looking at. I agree that it is very valuable to look at it from a USD standpoint, and there's 2 ways to look at it. One is from an absolute dollar amount, which I would argue is about $10 billion. and I'm more than happy to explain how I came up with this $10 billion number. But the point of Bitcoin is to be resilient to nation state attacks, and $10 billion is nothing. It's peanuts for a nation state like China or Russia or the United States, or even like individuals. like Elon Musk spent $40 billion acquiring one company, Twitter. That's 4 times what it would take to attack Bitcoin today. Now we can hope that the price of Bitcoin increases by 10x or 100x, but even if it increases to 100x, let's do the thought experiment. It would be a $200 trillion asset, right? It would be a double-digit percentage of all of the wealth of the whole world. Even in that situation, it won't be secure. And the reason is that the fees, which amount for about 1%, from a USD denominated standpoint, would still be like the same. The total revenue would still be the same, right? Because would be left with the fee portion, which is 1%, but then because the price of BTC went up by 100x, we have the same kind of revenues, and so we should expect the cost of 51% attacking Bitcoin when the price has reached 100x of what it is today to still be the same as what it is today. So it would cost $10 billion for even a pariah state like North Korea to attack $200 trillion. It doesn't feel secure from the perspective of a malicious entity like a nation state that doesn't even seek to have profits from the attack. But if you're willing to move to this rational model where you have someone who's determined to make money out of it, really what you should be looking at is not the absolute dollar amount, but it is the amount relative to what you stand to gain. And here you need to look at the various sources of income from making an attack, either through emptying the BitVM bridges or through monopolizing which transactions can go through and therefore charging whatever fee you want, 3, 20, or 90% for transacting on Bitcoin, or through taking a short on the perp markets. Now, as to why this is not reflected in Bitcoin, I mean, I believe that the markets are highly irrational, especially when we're dealing with quite frankly like uneducated participants. The Bitcoiners don't have an incentive to talk about this, even though it is public information. There's a lot of digging heads in the sand, and one of the things that I've done, for example, is I've challenged Michael Saylor publicly on Twitter to discuss this very topic. He's not interested in discussing it, right? Because he's interested in kind of this religion, this cult. Ultimately, Bitcoin is a meme coin, and you could ask the same question about Dogecoin or Thoughtcoin or any other meme coin. Like, why does it have value? I guess the answer is that the efficient market hypothesis doesn't hold for these markets, especially when the time frames of interest of these participants is quite narrow. It's on the order of months and years. It's very, very difficult to project yourself 10 years into the future.
Okay, I don't see any questions, but I think the conclusion is that the market is inefficient, that what is being priced is not reflecting all of the risk.
I mean, there is a story out there, which is that the security of the Bitcoin proof of work blockchain is uncorrelated with the value of the asset, and there could be a decoupling of the two. You could imagine, for example, BTC, asset, living on another blockchain, which is secure, and that is a potential outcome. You could also imagine the exponentially decaying issuance being rectified with some sort of tail issuance, for example, 1% tail issuance. But I think both of these things are very difficult to imagine what happened just because of cultural limitations of Bitcoiners, right? Bitcoiners love their 21 million limit. Having tail issuance goes against that. And Bitcoiners, love proof of work, and moving to a proof of stake chain, for example, which would be secure, seems like very, very culturally difficult.
We do have another question, and Lambus asks, after this incident, wouldn't those miners be hard forked out of the chain immediately, losing their entire investment?
Yeah, great question. So you are right that in proof of stake, the consensus participants are identified with a public key. And so if there is a censorship attack or other form of attack in proof of stake, you can identify the attacker and you can fork them out, and all of their stake is essentially burnt and destroyed. In proof of work, you don't have this luxury. The consensus participants are not identified. Every unit of hash rate is fungible and indistinguishable from any other unit of hash rate. And you can't just fork out the bad guys and only keep the good guys. What you can do as an option is what's called the nuclear option of completely changing your proof of work algorithm. But that has the downside of not only nuking the bad guys, but also the good guys. And so now you have to rebuild your security from scratch. And the most likely candidate for a V2 of the proof of work algorithm would be to leverage some sort of commodity hardware, maybe CPUs or GPUs. But then again, you have the exact same issues that you have with SHA-256 proof of work, which is that a single entity can just amass sufficiently many CPUs or GPUs to perform the attack again. And the economics wouldn't change because the issuance would change and the fee situation wouldn't change.
So one more, I guess there's a couple of questions on vulnerability of other chains other than Bitcoin. And I think you've kind of partially talked about that. This is a proof of work situation with Bitcoin. So this doesn't affect in the same way Ethereum or Solana?
Yes, so proof of work chains have two advantages. The first one is that if an attack does happen, then you can recover from the attack. The second advantage is that proof of stake chains tend to have much, much larger what's called economic security, which is the total number of dollars currently securing a system. And in a proof of stake chain, it's very easy to measure economic security. You just look at all of the stake, and then you multiply it by the price of the token. So in the case of Ethereum today, we have about 30 million ETH staked. It's about $2,000 per token. So we have about $60 billion of economic security that is currently securing the system. And one of the things you'll note is that 60 billion is 6 times larger than 10 billion, which is the economic security on Bitcoin. And the reason has the ratios are more favorable for proof of stake is because with proof of stake, you don't have this inefficiency of having to expend electricity and buy hardware. And so with a much, much smaller security budget, basically the revenue for the consensus participants, you can have much, much larger amounts of economic security. And it basically boils down to the cost of capital. That's what the consensus participants are paying by locking their stake, and they need to be compensated with fees and issuance for this cost of capital. Cost of capital is a few percentage points. It might be 3% per year or 4%, something like that. It's very, very small. In the case of Bitcoin, the way that empirically the math comes out is that for every $1 of economic security, you have to spend $1 per year. So it's extremely high maintenance. It's a 100% cost of capital, if you will. And the reason is that you have to continuously burn electricity, and you also have these mining rigs, which are exponentially depreciating assets that, after a period of 5 years or so, just have to be recycled or binned.
Okay, so one last question before we move on to the second part. Michael's asked this question: what changes to the Bitcoin protocol would fix this? Possibly a minimum fee?
So the issue with kind of manipulating the fee market is that you might end up in a worse position, because if you have a minimum fee, then anyone who's currently willing to pay for a fee that's smaller than the minimum might not be willing to transact. And also, in a well-functioning Bitcoin blockchain, the natural equilibrium is to have this first price auction, and you can try and set a minimum fee. So, for example, you could say it needs to be at least 100 sat per VByte to make a transaction. But then, what could happen off-chain is that the miner would offer a refund. So, for example, they could offer a refund of 90 sats per VByte. And the Bitcoin blockchain will have no visibility over this refund. So that's what's called a side channel payment. And so it's not really possible to enforce the fees, at least naively. One thing you could do is have the Bitcoin fees be burnt and go in some sort of a pot, which would get redistributed to miners over a long period of time. Kind of something like EIP 1559 that we have in Ethereum. I mean, one thing that I didn't mention is that not only is the fee situation alarming from an absolute standpoint, but it's also very alarming from the point of view of volatility. During weekends or during night hours in the US or during holidays, the fees tend to dip. And so things become extremely weird from a game theory standpoint. And various papers have been written on how the Bitcoin blockchain won't be stable if the revenue from the miners are so volatile.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for those insights.
Absolutely. So let me now talk about what I was originally planning to talk, which is about the pre-conf-centric Ethereum. And the talk is basically in three parts. The first part is about this fundamental notion of time in consensus, which is what we call slots. And what I'll try and argue in this first part is that it makes sense to have big slots, long slots. And then in part two, I'll talk about preconfirmations and this new notion of time, which is called a tick. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the network effects that arise from potentially introducing these preconfirmations. Okay, so as I mentioned, in consensus, usually, at least for proof of stake systems, we have this enshrined unit of time, which is called a slot. And on Ethereum, it's currently 12 seconds. And for the Beam chain, it's proposed to be 4 seconds. And in this environment where in every slot you have a rotating proposer, the expected confirmation latency, basically the expected amount of time it takes for your transactions to be confirmed as a user, is going to be 1 ping time. So the time it takes for you to communicate the transaction to the proposer, plus the time it takes for the response to come back, plus a slot over 2. And the reason there's this divide by 2 is because, you know, sometimes you'll get lucky if you submit your transaction just before the end of the slot, and you might only have to wait 1 second or 2 seconds. And sometimes you get really unlucky. You know, you might have to wait a full 11 seconds because you submitted it 1 second after the boundary of the previous slot. And so the way that the math turns out is that you have to wait a slot over 2. So if ping time is about, say, 100 milliseconds and slot is 12 seconds, then you have to wait, roughly speaking, 6 seconds and 6.1 seconds. Now, what I'd like to argue is that in the context of decentralized sequencing, it makes sense to have big slots. So basically to have this rotation of the proposers be fairly slow. And one reason has to do with the validator count. So if you want to have a decentralized system and you want to have things like single slot finality, you want every single proposer to participate in every single slot. But what that means is that you have a limited capacity for validators, because if you have, for example, you know, let's say n validators, that's n network messages that have to be gossiped and processed within one slot. And so the longer the slot you have, the more time you have to process all of these messages, and basically the more validators you can have. And the more validators you can have allows us to have a smaller barrier to entry to becoming a validator. So the minimum amount of stake that you need reduces. So today on the Beacon chain, it's 32 ETH, which is, you know, still quite a lot of money. It's close to $100,000, and the larger the slots we have, the smaller this amount will be. Another reason has to do with geographical decentralization. If you have extremely small slots, you're basically encouraging the validators to be close to each other because of something known as timing games. So one useful metric is what I call slot to ping, the slot to ping ratio. So that's the slot duration divided by the ping duration. So in the case of Ethereum today, one slot is 12 seconds. The ping is 100 milliseconds. And so the slot to ping is 120, which is, you know, very high and very generous. And what that means is that if you're a very, very sophisticated entity and you can, you know, build your transactions so your blocks and gossip them you know, significantly faster than your peers, you'll be able to shave off roughly 1 ping time, right? Because if you have like private fiber, for example, and you can gossip information faster than your peers, at most what you can win is 1 ping time. And so your edge over your peers will be on the order of 1%, which is not very high. But if you look at a blockchain like Solana, for example, their slot duration is 400 milliseconds. And so slot to ping is 4, and then a very sophisticated entity can potentially have an edge of, you know, on the like double digit percentages, and that can lead to high centralization over time. Another reason for having long slots has to do with this idea called attester-proposer separation. So again, for decentralization, what we're trying to do in Ethereum is to make sure that the attesters are as unsophisticated as possible. And right now, the validators have to do 2 tasks. On the one hand, they have to vote as attesters, and they have to propose the blocks. And proposing, as it turns out, is quite sophisticated, because it touches the so-called MEV pipeline. So you have to, for example, choose a relay. You have to play timing games. You're exposed to the MEV lottery, meaning that it's a random process whenever you do get proposed, you selected as a proposer, once every few months. And when you do get selected, it's also a lottery as to whether or not the slot that you're in is one with high MEV. So if there's very high volatility in the markets, if the Fed, for example, announces that they're going to do a rate hike or whatever it is, then these are the slots where you can make a lot of money. And what happens when you look at the distribution of MEV, the average amount of MEV is quite a bit higher than the median amount of MEV. And the reason it's like this is because there's a few slots where the proposer won the jackpot. They made potentially millions of dollars just on this one slot. And the jackpots are highly concentrated in a few lucky winners. And so your median validator won't have access to this. And so the way that you would defend against this is with smoothing pools or staking pools. And that's a source of centralization. So long story short, we'd like to separate the roles of attesting and proposing. And the constructions that we have involve having interleaving slots. We have consensus slots, execution slot, consensus slot, execution slot. And this basically effectively doubles the slot duration from the point of view of UX. And then a final reason for having long slot durations has to do with snarkification of the chain. So we're reaching a tipping point in 2025 where finally snark technology is mature enough to allow us to prove the validity of the whole Ethereum chain in real time. Actually, there's a new series of calls that started recently called ETH proofs, where we talk about these so-called ZKVMs that prove the validity of the whole Ethereum chain, and they do so in real time. And what we mean by in real time is within one slot. So within 12 seconds, you can have a snark proof that the last Ethereum block was indeed a valid Ethereum block. And having these long slots, 12 seconds, a fairly generous amount of time, means that you can have higher gas limits. And the reason is that there's some fixed cost in the latency of proving EVM blocks. And so the greater your slots are, the smaller the fixed cost is relative to the slot duration. Okay, so this is the end of the first section, where basically I'm trying to argue that if indeed you do care about decentralization, and Ethereum cares very much about decentralization, then it is a good idea to have long slots. But the main downside of long slots is that UX is not very good. So can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we have excellent UX and decentralization? And in my opinion, the answer is yes. And this involves kind of a new concept, which is known as preconfirmations, or preconf for short. What is a preconfirmation? It's very, very simply, it's just an agreement, a bilateral agreement between a user or a set of users and the next proposer. So the idea is that I know as a user who is the next proposer in the blockchain, and I can go and talk to that proposer and say, hey, I would like my transaction to be included in your block. And the next proposer can say, hey, I promise to include your transaction at this position. And they can even tell you how this transaction will execute. So for example, if you're doing a Uniswap swap, the proposer can tell you, like on the spot, this is the price that you'll get, these are the fees that you'll pay. And And so from a UX standpoint, it's as if your transaction had been included, but it hasn't yet been included. It will only be included at the end of the slot when the block actually gets proposed. And so this brings us to this new alternative unit of time, which is more relevant from a UX standpoint, which is a tick. So you should imagine that a slot is broken down into much smaller ticks. A tick might be, for example, 10 milliseconds. And so a 12-second slot would have, 120 ticks. 1,200 ticks, something like that. In any case, many more ticks than there are slots, and the expected pre-confirmation latency would go down to something very, very close to optimal. It would be the ping time plus a tick over 2. So if the tick is 10 milliseconds, it would be ping time, which is roughly 100 milliseconds plus 5 milliseconds. And this is the type of UX that you get in a Web 2 environment. And to complement this new notion of tick, we also have a notion of shred. And this is basically the equivalent of a block, but in the context of pre-confirmations, you can think of it as a mini block, a little shred that is a subset of a block. So if time passes tick 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 from left to right, the block would be built from top to bottom, where the top of the block would contain the very first thread, and then the second thread, and then the fourth thread. And so it's a very, very different way of building the blocks, and it's actually one that resembles how things are done in Solana today.
So there's a clarification question from Fahad. Would the proofs be at the block level? That is, that there are proof that the block is valid, or would it be at the transaction level? For example, the testers don't need to execute every block and just verify a proof.
Yeah, so the reason why we can have such amazing latency is because the attesters are not involved. There's 0 attesters in the picture here. We only have the proposer and the users. And what the users do is that they establish a direct connection between them and the proposer, and they have this off-chain bilateral agreement only with the proposer. And again, the attesters are not involved. Now, the way that the system is enforced is using collateral. So as I'll discuss later, the proposer has posted some amount of collateral, and the promises that they make, the preconfs, are backed by the collateral. So if for whatever reason the preconf is not honored, meaning that the transaction is not included in the next block as promised, then the proposer would get slashed. Okay, so the thesis of the preconf-centric Ethereum is that really what we want, the best case scenario, is long slots for decentralization and short ticks for UX. And this is something that we're starting to see across all of Ethereum. So for example, Base has, I believe, 2-second slots, or maybe it's 1-second slots, but they're rolling out 100 millisecond pre-confirmations. So their tick duration is 100 milliseconds. And that is even faster than Solana, even with 100 millisecond ticks. But the tick duration, because you're dealing with a single counterparty and there's no networking like peer-to-peer networking overhead with the attesters, that can be shrunk down effectively arbitrarily. So 10 millisecond ticks is something that's totally possible. On the other hand, 10 millisecond slots will never be possible, because at the very least, one slot needs to be at least as long as a ping time, which is on the order of 100 milliseconds. Now, in order to have these preconfirmations, there's two requirements. Requirement number one is that the user needs to know who the next proposer is. And this is known as the proposer look ahead. There needs to be visibility as to who can make these promises. And this is something that we have on Ethereum. Actually, you can know the next 32 proposers, a full epoch's worth of proposers. And the second thing that you need is collateral. In order for the promises to be credible, there needs to be some value at stake. And so the way that these systems work is that there's a notion of a registration contract, which is some sort of smart contract where the proposers can post collateral that will back their pre-confirmations. And there's this notion of slashing. So if a promise that was made off-chain is not honored, then that promise, like proof that the promise was not honored, can go on-chain and can go slash the proposer. And there's two types of faults, pre-conf faults. There's safety faults and liveness faults. So safety faults basically says that the proposer promised to include me, for example, in position 10, but they included me in position 20. This is not as I expected, and so that's a type of fault, and I can go slash the proposer. And then another type of fault is liveness fault, where there's no block at all. Like for whatever reason, the proposer did not produce a block in that slot, and that also counts as a slashable fault. Now, the way that these pre-confs are being built out today is by introducing this notion of gateways. So that is some sort of an operator that will perform the pre-confing on behalf of the proposer. And the reason is that pre-confing is a sophisticated job. You're receiving inbound transactions from potentially thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, and you have to have very high uptime. You need to have low latency, and you need to be able to combat denial of service attacks. And there's all sorts of infrastructure that's required to give out these pre-confirmations, and that goes at odds with what we're trying to achieve on Ethereum, which is to have the validators be as unsophisticated as possible. And so just like we have a notion of a relay for confirmations, so the block building pipeline involves this entity called a relay, there would be the equivalent for pre-confirmations, and it would be called a gateway. And gateways mainly need to be sophisticated from a DevOps standpoint. They don't need to be sophisticated from a financial standpoint, just like relays today only need to be DevOps sophisticated. Now, there's two technical problems that need to be solved for pre-confirmations. The first one is known as the fair exchange problem, which is that the user can make a request for pre-confirmation, and the pre-confer now is in a position of power whereby they have the option to honor the pre-confirmation and or not honor it, and they can basically not respond with the actual pre-conf to the user. So the user has made the request, they've paid for the pre-confirmation, but they don't actually know that whether or not the pre-conf has gone through. And the way that we would solve this is basically by requiring the pre-conf to be gossiped publicly. So every time a user makes a request, we would expect the gateway to make the corresponding pre-conf public. And if for whatever reason the pre-confs no longer are shared publicly, well, the wallets can just stop sending pre-conf requests. And so in the worst case, what will happen is that the last pre-conf request would not receive the corresponding pre-conf, but from that point onwards, the wallets would stop sending the pre-conf requests. And then there's a second challenge, which is more difficult, related to tip pricing. So every preconf request would come with a preconf tip, just like a confirmation request comes with a confirmation tip. And you need to be able to price it in such a way that it's rational for the proposer to process the preconfirmation. And here there's opportunity cost involved, which is that if a proposer says, hey, I promise to include your Uniswap swap at position 10, well, that means that if there's some sort of an arbitrage opportunity that appears in the future during the next few seconds in the slot, then that arbitrage opportunity might be lowered by the existence of the transaction at position 10. And so really what you need to do is price the tip in such a way to compensate for the opportunity cost of the proposer. And one of the interesting things here is that the tip can be negative, meaning that you can imagine an unsophisticated user creating a Uniswap trade which goes against the market and increases the arbitrage opportunity. And therefore, the proposer is actually willing to pay the user to have the pre-confirmation processed, because it means that they're expecting a larger arbitrage opportunity at the end of the slot, and therefore more MEV. Okay, so besides pre-confirmations impacting UX, I believe that they are the key to fixing one of Ethereum's biggest problems, which is this rollup fragmentation that we have. So today we have L2s or rollups that are siloed. And if you want to communicate between two L2s, you have to do so asynchronously, meaning that you have to start your transaction in rollup A, and then some amount of time passes, and then you finish the transaction on rollup B. So for example, if you want to transfer funds, one way to do it is to go through the L1. That's kind of step number one. And then step number two would be to deposit from the L1 to the other rollup. And the key pain point with this asynchronous mode of composition is that it makes it very, very difficult to do DeFi with network effects. One of the reasons why DeFi has been so successful on Ethereum is because, at least on Ethereum L1, is because a money Lego like Aave can permissionlessly use Uniswap, another money Lego, all in one transaction. And this is what unlocks the notion of liquidations. So if you have Aave on rollup A and you have Uniswap on rollup B, well, unfortunately, unless if the only thing you have is asynchronous composition between these rollups, then Aave can't actually use the liquidity to do the liquidation. So what we'd like to do is restore this notion of synchronous composability, and therefore restore all of the network effects that come with it. And really, there's two key ingredients to get synchronous composability. The first one is called shared sequencing, and the other one is called real-time settlement. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on real-time settlement. I want to focus on the shared sequencing. What does it mean? It means that at any given moment in time, at any given slot, it's the same entity that can sequence multiple rollups A and rollup B. And the fact that they share the sequencer basically allows the shared sequencer to craft transactions, such as liquidations, that involve both of the rollups at the same time. And you can even do what's called flash loans, which is just fundamentally impossible to do in an asynchronous setting. But this brings us to a challenge, which is how do the rollups agree on the shared sequencer? And this is a human coordination problem, which has to do with neutrality. So if you take two rollups, two competitive rollups, for example, Arbitrum and Optimism, how do they agree on a common shared sequencer? Certainly, what would not work is for Arbitrum to adopt the Optimism sequencer or vice versa, because these would be competing sequencers. And so what we really need is a credibly neutral sequencer, which doesn't introduce a new brand, a new security assumption, or a new token. And on Ethereum, there's only one such sequencer, which is the L1 sequencer itself, also known as the based sequencer. Based because it's the base layer that's doing the sequencing. And the base sequencer is an amazing sequencer for many reasons. It inherits the security of the L1, it's neutral, and it comes with many network effects because most of the TVL, 90% of the TVL, is on the L1 today. And so if you share sequencing with the L1, you'll be able to draw into these network effects. But there's one big problem, which is that the base sequencer has 12-second slots, which is just too long for modern blockchain UX, which is where the base preconfirmations come in. So all of this preconfirmation infrastructure that I was talking about works for any decentralized sequencer, or even centralized sequencers. And in particular, it works for the base sequencer. And so I believe that there's an opportunity for Ethereum to simultaneously have the UX of Web2 and restore the network effects by having the base sequencer be this common sharding point for all of the rollups to tap into if indeed they want to share these network effects.
So who is the base sequencer?
It is the L1 sequencer. So it would be the collection of L1 proposers. So whoever is proposing the L1 block would also be proposing rollup blocks, at least for all of the base rollups. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, so Fahad's got a question. Why would the L2s agree to give up sequencing rights to the L1?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So there's this famous quote, which is, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. So we need to analyze the incentives. From the point of view of the rollups, there's two sources of income. One of them is what's called congestion fees, and the other one is what's called contention fees, or MEV. So the first one on Ethereum is implemented as EIP 1559. There's a fixed gas limit, and if there's more demand than there is supply, the so-called base fee, the base congestion fee, will go up and up and up, and then the system finds an equilibrium at the right price. The good news is that rollups can capture this congestion fee regardless of the sequencer. So, for example, if Optimism became a base rollup tomorrow, they would still capture all of their congestion fees within their economy and their virtual machine. On the other hand, the second form of income is MEV from the sequencer, also known as contention fees. And the reason is that it's about the specific ordering of transactions. And you have some transactions that are contending with others because they need to be first. So for example, the classic example is an arbitrage, right? The arbitrageurs are contending against each other, and they're basically willing to bid against each other to capture this very top of the block. And what happens is that contention fees by default goes to the sequencer. So if Optimism were to become based, it would lose the MEV. And so the question becomes, if I become based? Do I make more revenue from congestion fees? And is that increase in revenue going to compensate for the loss of MEV? Now, my personal thesis is that we're going to see MEV go down dramatically in the months and years to come. And the reason is that applications are becoming more and more sophisticated, such that the MEV flows upstream towards the application and its users, and peripheral infrastructure like wallets. So, we've seen Uniswap v4. It has this notion of hooks. We've also seen Unichain, and a lot of MEV that was created in the context of Uniswap v3 simply won't leak to the rollup sequencer in a Uniswap v4 context. And so, on the other hand, for congestion fees, what I expect will happen is that if you have synchronous composability, you're going to have more traffic. And the reason is that more transactions are going to be viable to happen across rollups. So if you have money Legos in your rollup, and those money Legos are especially valuable, then what will happen is that users from other rollups will want to compose with them. And the classic example is arbitrage. So if you have a DEX aggregator like 1inch or Matcha, and you're making a trade, you want to have best execution possible, and so you're going to route your trade through all of the rollups that have synchronous composability, and that's going to ultimately increase congestion fees, which is a win-win for all of the rollups that share this network effect. And so the mental model that I have is that we're going to be in the position soon of what I call the MEV gambit, whereby an individual rollup can choose to forego their MEV, which might be a small fraction of their income, maybe 1% or 10%. And this loss of MEV will be counterbalanced by an increase in congestion fees, by the fact that they're connecting with this much bigger economy.
Okay, we've got a couple of related questions. The first one by Tim Roughgarden. You discussed off-chain bilateral agreements between proposers and users. How do you see builders fitting into this picture? And then the second question, which is related, I think, will the pre-conf make the builder proposer more centralized since they need to bear more cost of the gas fee volatility?
Yes, great questions. So in some sense, building as we know it disappears in the context of preconfirmations, right? Because what we have today is this monolithic building whereby you look at all of the flow that you have over a long period of time, a whole slot, and then you have very, very sophisticated algorithms that will do the ordering of these transactions and very clever insertions, before, after individual user transactions. In the context of preconfirmations, all of this sophistication in some sense collapses, whereby you just go first come, first serve. Like you go with the simplest possible algorithm for sequencing. And because the user is directly talking to the proposer, there is no builder in between, and there is no relay either. And if you're willing to accept a future upgrade with the Beam chain called attested proposer separation, then there is no gateway either. It's just the user and the proposer and no one else. There's no other intermediaries. Now, one of the potential sources of complication have to do with the tip pricing. Like, sure, the ordering is kind of straightforward, but the pricing of the tip is difficult. Now, one of the potential easy way out here is to design some sort of auction mechanism so that the pricing emerges without the system requiring a lot of sophistication. And one of the things that's being proposed here is basically just have decreasing priority fees. So within each tick, within each unit of 100 milliseconds, you have a priority fee auction, and this is exactly what, at least as I understand, Base is looking to do very soon on mainnet. And it's also what Unichain is doing.
So there are still additional questions. Are you okay going a little longer than our
Yeah,
time?
for sure.
Okay. So Gurnor asks, does MEV flowing upstream, that is being captured by the application, impact synchronous composability between applications?
Great question. So there's various kind of methods, and some of them might not be known today for preventing this MEV leakage. So one of them could be, for example, batch auctions. Or another one could be to have a custom sequencer, which is what Unichain is doing. And both of these things do affect synchronous composability. So maybe what we will see is kind of this. Well, it's very hard to predict, but the optimistic take is that applications will become sophisticated enough that they can be simultaneously composable and not leak MEV. But yeah, it is also possible that we see a two-track approach. We basically see the equivalence of Binance that are not composable. So if you think of Binance as an exchange, it's very efficient. It doesn't leak MEV, but it's not at all composable from the point of view of the blockchain. And if you think of Unichain as being this Binance on chain, which is a more decentralized version, but not necessarily much more composable, that could live in parallel to existing pools of liquidity that are suitable for things like liquidations. But yeah, the honest answer is I actually don't know.
Can you talk a little bit more about the collateral? So let's say that I'm a user and I've got like a very valuable transaction, but I'm concerned that there's not enough collateral to cover maybe the slashing. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So collateral sizing. The good news is that we have a lot of data that comes from the MEV-boost market. So the PBS markets, proposer builder separation, basically gives us a proxy for how valuable each slot is. Basically, how much arbitrage opportunity, for example, there is in any given slot. And what we've seen is that for the vast majority of blocks, 90% of blocks, the value of the block that emerges from the PBS auction is less than 1 ETH. And so what the argument basically says that for the vast majority of users, a tiny amount of collateral, just 1 ETH, is sufficient to back that transaction. So let's take an example. Let's say that I want to make a trade on Uniswap, and it's a $10,000 trade. I receive a pre-confirmation from the proposer, and then a few seconds later, there's some sort of huge spike of volatility, and the proposer is incentivized to renege on the pre-confirmation because the value that they gain from the arbitrage opportunity is greater than their collateral that they stand to lose. Well, in practice, the amount of volatility that you would need on on the $10,000 trade would need to be extremely high within 12 seconds. So I don't know, if one ETH is $2,000, you would need the price of the asset to move by something like 10% within 12 seconds, which empirically speaking, when you look at the MevBoost data, just doesn't happen very often. So this is for like the basic amount of collateral for the vast majority of the users. But what you can also have for more sophisticated users is arbitrary large amounts of collateral. And the collateral doesn't have to be Ether. It can be any asset. So it could, for example, be restaked ETH. Every validator has ETH just to be a staker, and so they can put forward that ETH. They could put forward some stable coin, and they can even put intangibles like their reputation at stake as a form of collateral, or even an NFT.
Interesting. So one more question, and then we need to close the room. These are big changes, and the timeline, I think you've put out to like 2029. Is there enough time? So given the competition that we've got for Ethereum, this is like a 4 or 5 year project. So I guess the question is on the timing. Is this too long of a horizon?
Yeah. So the way that you introduced the talk, Campbell, is as a beam chain talk. But the reality is that what I talked about doesn't really have much intersection with the beam chain at all. And the good news is that preconfirmations don't require hard fork. Like preconfirmations is something that you can do today, and it's something that people are doing today. So the timelines are orthogonal to the beam chain timelines. I guess one point of intersection has to do with APS, whereby before we have APS, it's necessary to have these gateways in order to protect the unsophistication of the validators. But once the validators are no longer responsible for proposing, again, thanks to APS, then we don't need the gateways, and that dramatically simplifies the design. But in the short term, people right now are building preconfirmations. And as I mentioned, projects that are live like Unichain already have preconfirmations.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for giving 2 talks. So one was a bonus. So we really appreciated your time and the responsiveness to our questions. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.